Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 5th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I am able to make it. But the only way I can make the show is by paying both my editor and my incredible producer and assistant. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And the way that we typically are able to do that is from ad sales, which, as you've mentioned, you haven't mentioned, as you've noticed, have really dwindled across podcasts over the last probably about a year or so, and Patreon. So if you are one of those individuals who can afford to support the show, who wants to show your support and offset that cost so that those who can't afford to do so don't have to, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. That's patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, so this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Mary Fissell. She is a professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, and she has been cited as an expert across, multiple outlets: the New York Times, Washington Post, Slate, Vice. She's also appeared on the BBC, and she wrote a previous book about the history of kind of how we understand fertility. But her new book is called Pushback: The 2,500-Year Fight to Thwart Women by Restricting Abortion. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Mary Fissell. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Cara. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about your new book, Pushback: The 2,500-Year Fight to Thwart Women by Restricting Abortion. So you are a historian of science and medicine. Is that correct? Would you use that title?
Yes, sometimes I say I'm a historian of health and healing, sort of a little more broad, but yes, exactly.
And so at Johns Hopkins, they have their own department dedicated to the history of medicine?
Yes, because that's kind of how the history of medicine got started as a discipline in the United States. My position is in the medical school, which is a little odd because I'm not an MD. And that's just how in the 1930s, the history of medicine got embedded in America in medical schools. I teach undergrads at the arts campus. I teach in the School of Public Health. I teach in the School of Medicine. We have a whole department for the history of medicine. It's great.
That is really, really cool. And so did you study history through and through? Did you study science at all? Like, how does one become a historian of medicine?
Well, I went to grad school at the University of Pennsylvania, and they have a department of the history and sociology of science that covers technology and medicine as well. And I think because what I work on is earlier time periods, like my sort of center would be the 17th century. Learning about science today isn't that helpful because what you're studying is so different. I did plenty of science classes as an undergrad. I'm not scared of science, but I also was a history major as an undergrad. And I'm a historian first. And what I like to say is I love the history of medicine because everybody gets born, everybody gets sick, and everybody dies. It's kind of a universal topic.
Yeah, it's true. And in your book, you decided to cover like the last 2,500 years. What year are we in right now? 2025. So we're quite a few shy of the 2,500-year mark, sort of AD or what do we call it now? ADE? No.
We call it BCE.
Yeah, BCE and CE. Okay.
CE, Christian era, exactly.
Right. And so you're actually looking at some years BCE in the book. How did you decide where to start?
That's a very rich question. And I think some of this comes out of the way history teaching happens in the United States versus Britain, where I've also taught. We teach these kind of big survey classes to undergraduates to kind of orient them to the big picture. So every other autumn, I teach the history of medicine from antiquity to about 1700 in a semester. So it's kind of seatbelts on, here we go. But I think undergrads don't ever get that kind of big picture in high school. So it's good for people to see that big picture. So I chose to start the book with the Hippocratic Corpus, which is 4th century BCE. That's a series of about 60 texts, books, manuscripts that are associated with the name Hippocrates. They're not all by him. Maybe none of them are actually personally by him, but they give us a very rich picture of the medical world of ancient Greece. And there's lots in there about women's reproductive health. So it made sense for me, I felt, to start with that piece because it was so detailed and rich.
And so that piece being so detailed and rich, I think by definition then would make it be true that abortion predated this era, or at least that women's health and initiatives towards women's health predated this, right? It's not like the year that it was written was the year that everything was developed and discovered. It was cataloged.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Because many of these Hippocratic texts were actually orally transmitted for a couple of generations before they actually got written down. And so, even the more so, but yes, what they represent is clearly kinds of empirical knowledge that have already been being assembled for some amount of time. We don't know what amount of time. I mean, at the most basic, I think that ending pregnancies goes as far back in the historical record as we can see.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, do we even know when the first sort of what we might now call an abortion took place? Or even if it was viewed as, I don't know, like, was abortion conceptualized wildly different in ancient Greece and even before?
Well, I think you've raised a really important point, which is that abortion is many things in the past. Even the word is quite tricky for most of the sort of English language usage of the last, say, 4 or 5 centuries. Abortion and miscarriage are often the same thing. It doesn't mean like an induced abortion, which is what they come to call it in like what we mean by abortion.
Even today, when we talk about abortion, you're right, we're often referring to like a medically or a pharmaceutically, medically or surgically induced abortion, but the word is still used to describe spontaneous abortion, right?
Exactly. There's another aspect to this, which has to do with the way abortion is mentioned in the Old Testament. There in the book of Exodus, they talk about what happens if men are fighting and one of them, in the violence of the fighting, bumps into a pregnant woman and causes a miscarriage. Now, we call that a miscarriage, but in this text, it's referred, usually translated as abortion, and various penalties are given for the man that causes this to happen. And it's really about endangering the life of the woman as much as anything else, because the later in pregnancy it is, the more the penalty. And so that suggests it's going to be more dangerous if she's further along in the pregnancy. The harm is likely to be the greater. And that concept of abortion, which is nothing like ours, really, gets embedded in medieval law, like right from the Bible. So that's a very different meaning than what we have today, but it was significant.
I even wonder how long have we known? Like, obviously, pregnancy is so visual. It's, we see pregnancies grow over a certain period of time, and then there is the sort of birth event. And so, even long before we had any kind of semblance of modern medicine or really understanding what is genetic material, or way before that, even understanding what is a cell, we sort of had a general idea that there's like a little human growing inside of a woman, and then that human is expelled. Did we know how it did we always understand conception, or did that come a lot later?
Well, actually, I want to take slight issue with you because I think that pregnancy was imagined very differently in the pre modern world. We have grown up in an era of fetal imaging and of conceptualizing a pregnancy as a person to be. And that's like how we imagine it, right? And that's partly because of the imagery. I think that in the pre modern past, it's very different. There's a classicist named Enzo Nardi, Italian scholar, who put this really eloquently. He argued that in antiquity, pregnancy was not, in fact, imagined as this like person to be, at least for much of it. He said it was but a hope. And I just think that's so poetic. In other words, there was a possibility that this process could result in, well, they wanted a son and heir, most likely, but there was the possibility this could result in a child. But it was much more ambiguous, uncertain, risky. And I think the way he put it is really beautiful because they couldn't really tell if a woman was pregnant or not until the middle of a pregnancy, which is the moment that they call quickening, which is when a woman first feels a fetus move within her. At that
Mm-hmm.
point, all of the confusion and like, am I or am I not, that was resolved. But don't forget, it's only the woman who knows, and she doesn't have to
Mm-hmm.
tell anybody if she doesn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, there's so much confusion about whether a woman were truly pregnant. Remember that women are malnourished often. They are pregnant or lactating for potentially a lot of their adult life. So, the kind of myth that we have that every woman menstruates every 28 days, which I think is a myth, but
Yeah.
that was much less the case then. So just not getting your period was not the kind of immediate, like, oh gosh, I better be concerned that I think it is for some people today. So I think there, until the middle of a pregnancy, there was much more uncertainty, etc.
Well, and I can imagine because, as you mentioned, there was a lot of malnutrition, obviously, disease. Medicine was quite lacking at the time. That a fair amount of women, like you mentioned, it was risky and it wasn't a guarantee. Well, of course, because there's probably quite a lot of whether we want to call them spontaneous abortions or miscarriages or even infant mortality after a certain or fetal mortality after a certain point, and even maternal mortality.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, today, something like 25% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, some of them so early that a woman never knows, a person never knows. And we have no reason to think that biologically we are that different to those in the past. So, yes, absolutely, there would have been a fair amount of pregnancy loss. And given all the other factors that I said about malnutrition, et cetera, possibly more than today. And yes, there's plenty of records of, late miscarriage, stillbirth. And yes, infant life was incredibly fragile. In early modern, well, medieval Europe, early modern Europe, it could be as high as 1 in 5 infants didn't make it to their first birthday. Just appalling levels of infant mortality.
And looking back at these very, very early texts, when we're talking about sort of ancient Greece and around that era that the classicists are studying, are physicians doing the prenatal care or the delivery, or is this mostly midwifery at this point?
Well, there are a lot of midwives, and midwives are the basic players for normal labor and delivery. But midwives, as far as we know, may not have been literate and they didn't leave written records. It's the Hippocratic physicians who wrote the texts that we have. So we're often getting things kind of at one remove. And classicists have argued back and forth like, is what's in the male authored texts things that they learned from women, especially from midwives, or did they just make it up? I
Right.
tend to, well, it's a legitimate question, right? I tend to go with the first, not the second, because it seems that there was quite collaborative relationships between midwives and physicians. They had different jobs. There wasn't like competition the way there it would become much later. And physicians did, for example, in the ancient world, if there was an emergency abortion, often caused by an incomplete miscarriage, they would do a surgical abortion, which is like terrifying to even contemplate, honestly, without anesthetics, antisepsis. But that was the only thing that stood between a woman and dying. And we see this tragically today, right? With women with incomplete miscarriages bleeding out in parking lots and such. We've known for millennia that that is an emergency situation and the uterus has to be cleaned out of whatever tissue is left there, or it can either be from infection or from bleeding or for other, a range of causes. That can be a deadly circumstance. So in that case, it was physicians who were doing that work. Physicians would often also, in these texts, recommend a wide range of herbal preparations that might end a pregnancy. And I'm guessing that they learned about some of those from women because that makes sense to me. It's not, these are quite empirical. They're not grounded in some theoretical pharmacology as far as we can see. They're, this works. Do this, this, and this. This works. So I do think there was some kind of knowledge exchange, even if we don't actually see that in the texts. It makes the most sense for how that knowledge was written down.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned this idea of induced abortion usually because of partial miscarriage. Even as early as in these Hippocratic texts, we were seeing procedures that either translated to or we would now kind of define as abortion.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The surgical stuff we mostly have from a first century CE Greek writer, Cyrannus, who describes in great detail this kind of surgical procedure. But the Hippocratic texts are full of plants that you can use to clean out a uterus, to end a pregnancy, to restore a menstrual cycle. There's an abundance of information in those texts.
How did the ancient Greeks view menstruation?
Well, they had the origins of what became humoral theory, which is what governed medicine all the way into really the middle of the 19th century. And in this system, the body is governed by the balance between four humors, which are imagined as, liquid entities, but they also take solid form in the organs. I mean, they knew there were organs inside the body, they weren't stupid. And in this system, women were definitionally colder and wetter than men. And that makes sense because it was within women's bodies that new life began. And they thought of it much like planting a seed in a field. These are agrarian people, and they know if you plant a seed in something that's too hot and dry, guess what? It's not going to happen, right? It's not going to do that. Because they were cooler and wetter, they didn't digest their food as thoroughly as men did, and there was leftover, basically, material that was not transformed into the four humors. And their bodies had to get rid of that extra, or it could cause harm. So, what a surprise, that's what menstruation is. It's getting rid of this surplus that might otherwise build up in the body and sort of poison a woman. And I think they were pretty acute observers because they noticed, for example, that dancers who got a lot of exercise might not menstruate. And they argued that that was because the excess was burned off in the exercise.
Interesting.
We still see that, right? That
Yeah.
someone who's excessively thin might not menstruate. They also thought that this menstrual blood was the sort of substance that nourished the fetus. And so you don't menstruate during pregnancy because that's being used for something else.
Right. Did they see it as, like, dirty or shameful, or did they see it as, like, vital and protected?
I think somewhere in the middle, I think the kind of shamefulness that we see much later, for example, in the 17th century, if a menstruating woman walks across grass, supposedly the grass is going to die. Well, they must have known better. There would have been an awful lot of dead grass.
Right.
They should have, I'm sure they must have recognized that. But no, it's not seen as like dirty or stigmatizing in these texts. It's the kind of regular return of the menses is really the key. Like women's bodies have this cyclic property, and it's really important that they maintain that.
And so what examples, when you go back to the earliest texts that you reference in the book, like help me understand a little bit more about how abortion might have been defined and what examples you came across. Was there a lot of writing about it? Was it sort of minimally mentioned?
Well, here we have a big interpretive problem that I think I need to address. And that is because it was really important that a woman menstruate regularly, there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of herbal preparations that would bring back a late period. However, you can immediately see that a late period could also be an early pregnancy. And some of the same plants that are recommended to clean out the uterus to end a pregnancy are the same plants that are used to bring on the menses often. And so I think there is a kind of middle ground almost where it could have been a late period, it could have been an early pregnancy, but something had to happen. And so those plants are recommended. I don't think that they're being euphemistic because I don't see any shame associated with ending a pregnancy. And the story that I start beginning of the book, this I start chapter 1 with, is this famous Hippocratic case of an enslaved young woman who's an entertainer, probably a singer, and she's hired out to entertain at men's parties. Probably she's doing sex work as well as singing. And she listens carefully to what the other women say about how you would know if you were pregnant. She pays attention because she knows that if she gets pregnant, she could be out on the street. She's not gonna be earning money at those parties anymore, and her role is to bring the money home for her enslaver. So, she realizes she's pregnant, she tells her enslaver calls in a relative who's a physician, and the physician recommends this process of really vigorous jumping,
Okay.
which we would no longer see as likely to end a pregnancy. But it works. A small piece of tissue falls out of her body on the floor, and she's not pregnant anymore. And none of this story is recounted as anything that anybody should be ashamed of. The physician wrote this down because he was explaining how he studied really early fetal development. And he's really interested in that lump of tissue. He's not interested in anything ethical or moral about this situation. There's just nothing shameful about it. This is the prologue to here's how I can understand how fetal development happens. And I think that story is really striking for what it shows about the lack of stigma, the lack of shame associated with ending a pregnancy. It's just part of medicine.
So when does that shift start to occur? Because obviously it does become deeply, deeply stigmatized.
Well, the way I see it is it comes and goes, actually. So, one of the moments that ending a pregnancy becomes more problematic is maybe in Rome in the first century CE. And that is when Roman women seemingly have greater autonomy. What these critics complain about is that they drive around in coaches in the city of Rome by themselves, gasp, faint, swoon, um, and that they're having affairs. They're being
Oh, no.
adulterous.
Yeah.
Oh no. Um, and so there's this kind of wave of complaint, and then the suggestion is that these women are ending pregnancies either to conceal adulterous relationships or because they're so vain they want to maintain their slim and girlish figures. I have to say, when I read these things, they seem like male fantasy. They don't
Of
seem
course. I mean,
particularly
they're all
well.
written through the male gaze. Yeah.
Right, exactly. They're not particularly connected. And it's also about a politics of nostalgia. These men are mourning a kind of simpler, better time when like women were more moral. And one of them, he says, "Oh, if only it was more like my mother Helvia, who never would have done this." And I'm like, how would you know your mother's intimate reproductive history? Really?
Right.
So there's this kind of powerful combination of things. In a sense, it's not so much about ending a pregnancy per se, it's about women gaining more power and a politics of nostalgia. So that's one of the first times that we see this kind of abortion is bad narrative. But again, that's only for like the upper classes. That's not for everybody. And then the next wave is really the concerns that early Christians have about when a fetus gets unsold. Because quite honestly, they're
Okay.
not so worried about the fetus, they're worried about the soul.
Right.
And if it's hard to determine if you're pregnant, it's even harder to have any idea when a fetus would be ensouled. Like, how would you feel that, right? It's completely ineffable. And so there's lots of arguments back and forth. And they can't figure it out. Sometimes they argue it's about formation, sometimes they argue it's about movement. It's on and on and on until finally in the high Middle Ages, like 11th century, the Christian church is beginning to kind of flex its administrative and bureaucratic muscles, and it decides to kind of make a decision here. And the decision they make is that it's actually quickening is the moment of ensoulment. And frankly,
Okay.
it's kind of a proxy. Like, how would you know? It's actually rather later than a lot of the earlier thinking. The earlier thinking could be 30 days or 60 days, etc. And sometimes the amount of days was different depending on the sex of the fetus. But of course, the person who's pregnant wouldn't know what the sex is. So that's not very helpful.
Hmm.
And so it's really what happens is that the church's decision that ending a pregnancy after quickening is really a mortal sin, that really creates that as like a moral hazard in a way that it really was not before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interestingly, ending a pregnancy before quickening, that's pretty minor. It's not good, but it's not at all the same for them as this much later ending a pregnancy. And so that's really when like abortion gets defined as wrong and you start to see very occasional people being prosecuted or finding themselves in a courtroom associated with ending a pregnancy.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about because obviously there is throughout all of history a coupling and a decoupling of morality, ideology, and of course legality. And so do you see them start to emerge kind of around the same time, like this stigma and this immoral stance against abortion and then legal efforts to suppress it?
Yes. And what I would say, the sort of sideways to that is that what's wrong about abortion changes over time a lot. And today, of course, it's all about what they like to call innocent unborn life. That's not what the concern was in the past, usually. Sometimes it's about the soul, but a lot of times, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, what they're really concerned about is abortion as an indicator that an unmarried woman is having sex. So they see that as a sign of immorality, and that immorality is troubling for communities that want to be religious and godly and show that they're governed correctly. A woman who's having sex outside of marriage threatens that kind of line. And they're also worried, and this is a little counterintuitive, I think. They're worried that if unmarried women are having sex, then they may give birth to babies that will have to be supported by the local government. Now, of course, you'd be like, but wait, if they abort, then there won't be a baby. True, but they see it as kind of a harbinger or a sign that women are misbehaving. And if women misbehave in this way, there can be babies without fathers to support them. And the local government will have to do that. And so it's really about the act that created this pregnancy that's worrying them. It's not the fetus itself. That's really not part of the mix.
I'm curious because obviously, we see that argument even to this day, this sort of, oh, she is immoral, she is too sexually active, she's, having sex outside of wedlock, blah, blah, blah. But there's also a very clear component, right? Those who are proponents of free and unfettered access to abortion services, they know that being able to choose when to terminate a pregnancy is an empowering thing for women, right? It allows us to make decisions about our lives that we wouldn't otherwise be able to make. Did they see that back then too? Like, uh-oh, these women, if they terminate a pregnancy, then they can keep doing that thing they were doing that made them a little too independent.
Well, I do think that you're right that I mean one of the book's big arguments is that abortion restriction is often gender backlash. And so it's when women assume some new measure of autonomy as those elite Roman women gallivanting around in coaches that conservative interests try to pull the arc of history back by limiting women's ability to manage their reproductive lives. So that's a big theme that I think is very important. But I also am really influenced by the reproductive justice movement, which suggests that very often women don't have a lot of choices, and that to understand ending a pregnancy as a choice, sort of independent of the other life variables, is to fundamentally misunderstand what's going on. And so I see there's some tough stories in my book where, women have very bad choices. For example, single women who got pregnant in many sort of Reformation era German towns, 16th, early 17th century, they really prosecuted sex outside of marriage, prosecuted the women, that is.
Of course.
And of course. And so if a woman had a baby, literally she and the baby would be run out of town, like out in a field somewhere with no resources. But if a woman were convicted of successfully ending a pregnancy, she might be executed. Like, what kind of options are those, right? They both are terrible. And like, how would we even think about choice in that context? Or historically, when we can see, most of the women ending pregnancies are married and already have children. That's just what you see over and over again. So that's not some like bad girl narrative that anti abortion activists love to kind of mobilize. That's someone who said, my family is big enough. I can't feed another mouth. Like, that's not a choice isolated from their other life circumstances. That's part and parcel of their life.
Yeah. When every choice is a bad choice, you don't really have choices. You're just trying to do what you can to survive.
Exactly. I love the way you put that. Every choice is a bad choice. Exactly. And it doesn't mean that the historical actors I write about were like powerless pawns. It just means that their choices were really awful.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really important point and really important perspective to maintain because sometimes I think we tend when we think about history to try and empathize, which is a natural human thing to do, empathize with the past by sort of transplanting ourselves as we are today into a different context or environment. But we wouldn't be who we are today if we were living in the past.
Exactly. I think that the power of imagination that you refer to is really important. And so when I was working on the book, I would really try to imagine respectfully what the world would have looked like from this woman's perspective. But I wouldn't presume to know that or to speak for her, but always being aware that imagination is a really powerful resource for historians. It can help you frame questions that you might not have thought of otherwise. And we don't have a lot of these women's own words because they weren't recorded or they were recorded under great pressure in a courtroom. But the power of imagination for a historian is to think about and feel about what it could have looked like from her perspective.
I'm curious about the sort of me think of the right word for this, paradox maybe, of a mounting Christian presence and power that's sort of sweeping the globe through outreach and missionary work. This mentality of pregnancy termination being sort of against God's will or being somehow empowering to like loose women, this idea that this is not a right that they should have access to. And then the later, although I think there were pieces all throughout history, and I'm curious for you to fill in the gaps here, of the kind of growing eugenics movement of like, well, within this sort of culture, this society, this governmental structure, we only want the best, the brightest, the purest. And so family planning is actually something that we promote as opposed to something that we don't want to see happen.
Yes, I think that's a really important theme, but I want to go sideways for a minute because I think there's a piece of the puzzle we didn't talk about yet that's also important to help us understand. And that is, I was really surprised. I didn't know this when I began the research. Very often in the past, there are laws on the books that forbid abortion. But when you look on the ground, what you see is toleration. What you see is people looking the other way, not asking the obvious questions, in some ways prioritizing an individual woman's well-being over the letter of the law. So there'll be these periods of like intense anti-abortion activism, but they burn out. They don't last. And then even if the laws are on the books, there's a tremendous amount of what I can only call toleration. So I think that's an important part of the story to understand as well. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's unacceptable.
Yeah, that's definitely important to know, and we've obviously had examples of that throughout kind of modern times with things like drug prohibition in certain cities up until they became decriminalized, and yeah, just different areas where like even though something might have been illegal, it was no longer a priority for governance.
Exactly, exactly. So eugenics is a really important theme. It goes all the way back in some ways. Aristotle discussed the fact that, abortion could be helpful in terms of making sure that people who were not healthy didn't reproduce. I was very shocked when I found that out. It's just a kind of sideline that he says. But really, we see this come into much more significance, obviously, in the late 19th and early 20th century. This idea that only some people should be allowed to reproduce. It's, grounded in nativism and racism through and through, the idea that some people are better than others. And this worry that like the wrong women are having babies, that that just it's all over the 19th and early 20th century. And that creates paradoxes in the history of abortion where people that you don't expect end up on one side of the equation or another. One of the people who I studied in Baltimore, who was a Black physician, graduate of Howard, who was providing abortion care to women, Black and white, in Baltimore in the 40s and 50s. I was stunned to read an article he published right after he got out of medical school around 1912, criticizing abortion because it was going to kill off Black people and it was clearly racist. And I'm like, I understand why you see things the way you did. That makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure that I think that's why all abortion should not be allowed, but I can see why, from your position, abortion was dangerous. And what I wish I knew, and I don't know and I can't find, is what made him change his mind. Because he does a 180, right? He's like anti, and then he's an abortion provider, a significant abortion provider. I think the answer is probably having to do with the kinds of misery he encountered in his patient population. Women who had 6 kids and just couldn't face a 7th, that kind of thing. And he knew how to do it safely. And the alternative was they saw somebody who wouldn't do it safely and they would suffer. That's my guess. I'll never know. But eugenics was he had a very plausible position in 1912 about why, from his perspective, abortion was wrong.
It's definitely interesting when we see these important social justice movements that sometimes don't or can't align, right? That sometimes butt up against one another, and you see individuals choosing to align themselves with specific movements where one right may be protected, but in doing so, another right is threatened. And I mean, it just reminds me of like the way that we vote today, that there are people who are single issue voters. And so long as their candidate promotes the one thing that matters to them, they're kind of like ignoring everything else and vice versa.
Yes, I don't resonate to that theme in some of the older history that I see. Mostly just I haven't thought about it that way, and because ending a pregnancy wasn't on the ballot in that way, if you know what I
Right.
mean.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
where that came from was not something people could vote on. But now, we understand reproductive rights as fundamental human rights.
Yeah, it is interesting that we almost can't talk about reproductive rights without talking about women's rights and women's empowerment. And throughout all of human history, I mean, I do think that there is sort of a misunderstanding or a misperception that there have been somehow these like secretive cultures in the past, and there have been these like deep societies where like women had power and women had, and I'm not saying men always had power. Angela Saini's book, The Patriarchs, does a really, really good job of talking about sort of the rise of patriarchy around the rise of, I guess, really it was about capitalism or even pre-capitalism, but around the rise of money and, money for goods and services. And that's when we start to see a lot of the changes in the way that women are cataloged and controlled. But it is really interesting to think about the fact that whether we're talking about 2,500 years ago or we're talking about today, we're also talking about the rights of women.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I've struggled with how I articulate because today, of course, given the world that we live in, we know it's not a simple pink blue binary male female, right? It's a more complicated landscape. And so today we would say people get pregnant. We wouldn't say women get pregnant. But in the time periods that I'm talking about, it is people who are called women who get pregnant, who seek to end a pregnancy. And because I'm arguing about gender regulations, I think it's really important that I call them women. But I always want to be like, but hey, let's remember that like there's a reason to do it that way. Obviously, people who don't fit into a neat binary have existed from the dawn of time, but it is important to understand the people I'm writing about are understood as women and that there's gender politics with that.
Well, and to be fair, even in modern eras, anybody who is trans feminine or trans masculine, anybody who is non binary, they experience the same, if not worse, vulnerabilities, subjugations, oppressions as women because they're still rooted in patriarchy, right? It's still rooted in the feminine is less than. And so whether you're a trans man or a trans woman, well, you're not in the minds of this male gaze that we're talking about, this patriarchal gaze, like the right kind of masculine man, therefore you are less than. So I think even if we're talking about people who can get pregnant and being as inclusive as possible, they're still subject to the same kinds of, horrific sexism and discrimination.
Yes, and I'd put a sort of another layer on that, which is that when states seek to regulate who we are sexually and reproductively, that's incredibly powerful, right? It goes to the core of how many people understand themselves. And so that's a really important kind of power that like affects people at their hearts. I think the other spin though I'd put on the patriarchy argument is kind of taking what you said and putting it in a slightly different way, which is that I think it's important we understand that patriarchy always has to be re-rehearsed and re-articulated. That it's not like a one-time deal that, all the women sign a piece of paper and it's a done deal. It's always fragile, right? It's always potentially under threat. And in a way, that's the good news.
But in a way, that's also the bad news because that's why it maintains, because there's this constant fight to like hold on to power.
Exactly. It gives us the hope that like there's some cracks in there that we can pry open, but it's more vulnerable than sometimes it appears. And I think that's like the good news. And it to me, when I'm looking at this reproductive stuff, especially for 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, it's really clear that, it sounds so basic, but that the amazing wonder that a female body can make a new person, which is amazing, is also deeply threatening to men. It's just so elemental and it's mysterious and they don't know and they can't understand and they can't do that exactly. And that's just very scary because a lot of them want heirs. They want sons. They want someone to give the farm to, whatever. At a very basic level, women's bodies have this amazing, miraculous power that is almost unknowable. And that's threatening.
I can imagine too that there was probably some, lack of understanding or motivated reasoning early on in this process whereby a woman who is pressured to give birth to an heir, to a male son, gives birth to a daughter, that's seen as somehow insolent or, like, oh, well, like she had some sort of power or choice in that, or she didn't want it bad enough, or she didn't try hard enough, or something like that.
Well, I think they were baffled about, how it is that it's male versus female.
Mhm.
So I don't know about insolent, but they just, it was a mystery to them how it was male or female. One of the models had it that sort of the male seed and the female seed met in the womb and kind of like duked it out. Whichever one was stronger on the night, that's the sex of the child, which I think is kind of an entertaining picture. So, like, if you went to bed with your husband and your husband was like tired and drunk, like you have a better chance of a daughter, kind of.
That's so random.
So random. But they also have prescriptions in some of these medical books for ordinary people, like have sex lying on your left side and that will have this sex. Have sex lying on your right side, because they're thinking in their understanding of anatomy. It has nothing to do with how we think about it. But even today, a great deal about reproductive medicine is unknown, right? As far as I understand, medicine today doesn't fully understand, for example, why labor starts when it starts. And so infertility, about a third of infertility is not understood. So there's still plenty of mystery.
But it is good to hear then that there's not a lot of references in the historical record to like women being blamed, I guess, for not delivering the appropriate gender or the appropriate, I guess, biological sex of a baby, as if she had any control over that whatsoever.
Yes, although obviously if you're a queen, see Henry VIII.
Right, exactly. I think that's maybe what was planting that seed in my mind. Like, I don't know, blame us for everything. Like, okay, sure, we have control over that too.
Hey Henry, maybe it's not the wives. But yes, I don't see that as a big theme, kind of blaming what sex it turns out to be.
That's good to hear. I am curious though, as a historian, I guess most all of the work that you do is poring over texts. It's digging into the historical record. Well, what is the historical record? It's times where things were written down, and whether we're talking about financial transactions or diaries or letters or medical texts, we don't know what happened if it wasn't recorded. And as we mentioned before, well, history throughout most of our history was recorded by men. So I'm curious, because you are more interested in kind of older eras of history, did you come across many early descriptions or representations of abortion through the female perspective?
Well, I will say overall, I was delighted and surprised by the extent of sources that I had available. When I started this, when I wrote a book proposal, quite honestly, I didn't realize just how much there was going to be out there. So
Oh,
that was
okay.
great. Very often, I don't have it from the woman's perspective. And that's why before, when we were talking about imagination, I think it's really important to like imagine how it might have looked. From the Middle Ages, we have court cases. I had never used court cases in my scholarship before, and I have to say they're kind of addictive because they get these amazing soap opera narratives, often tragic and sad, but and it's obviously like what a woman says in court when she might be at risk of losing her life.
Right, like under duress, like, yeah, you've got to take it with a grain of salt.
Exactly, many grains of salt. But you also have these kind of random like bits of real life that pop up in what someone says that you might not otherwise have access to. And I find that absolutely delightful. Like I've been working on a case from England in 1667. It's in this little tiny town, and a woman accuses the local minister of fathering her child. She's not married. And he very unwisely takes her to court for libel. And there's a series of depositions that survive that have this kind of evidence about it. And so we have like individual women's voices, okay, recorded by a scribe, okay, it's part of a court proceeding. But we have women describing like how they advised this young woman where to find the abortion producing plants in local gardens. And that's an amazing level of detail that I just never thought I would be able to access. That's super rich. So there, I don't have much of the actual woman's voice, the libel, the person, but I have all these other women talking, men too, but I have women talking, and that kind of access is I think just remarkable.
Were you able to come across any rich descriptions of the process itself? Not so much like this is how you do it, or this is what you need to look for, or this is how we advised her, but like somebody talking about, and then I puked my guts out for a day straight, or, and then like, do we know how kind of violent the experience was historically?
We don't. I mean, we have the same plants are used for millennia, and they're dangerous. Women were dying of pennyroyal poisoning in the 1930s. It breaks your heart because some of these plants might be effective, but the window between effective and deadly is quite narrow. So do not try this yourself under any circumstances.
Right, to kill the developing fetus, obviously, it may not be that much of a stretch to kill the
Right,
mother as
it could
well.
be pretty poisonous to the system. So, what we know is usually what we know is a couple of days of pain and cramping and bleeding. And in a way, I use evidence from the other side of the coin on that because one of the things that truly surprised me when I was working on this material was finding a 6th century Irish holy woman who performed a miracle ending of pregnancy. Like a saint, really? Ending a pregnancy? Really? So, St. Bridget, as she became known of Kildare, ran a convent, was the abbess or the head of the convent, and a young woman, like we would call her a novice probably, was going to become a nun and forgot herself and had a brief affair with some man and got pregnant and repented, was really upset and very, remorseful. And, her belly was beginning to show. And Bridget just put her hands on the belly and instantly the pregnancy was gone. Instantly. That's what I think makes it a miracle. And in one of the texts, it's actually the woman who was spared the pains of childbirth, which I think is
Wow,
a very
cool.
interesting title because it says she didn't have all that cramping and stuff. It was literally instant. And so I argue that women who might have heard this story read aloud, because often these kinds of saints' lives were read aloud, they would know it's a miracle because they knew that herbally ending a pregnancy was not an instant and painless procedure. Like it worked, but it wasn't fun to go through. And so I think that is very interesting to think about that this was miraculous, not because it happened, but because of the way that it happened. That tells us about common knowledge.
It's also miraculous that it was seen as miraculous when it flies in the face of what would traditionally be seen as a good thing. But I guess because she was a nun, yeah.
Amazing. And she's not the only one. There's a monk who's like maybe in a monastery about 25 miles away, and a local baron kidnaps a young woman against her will. Again, a young woman who I think is committed to a holy life, captures her, takes her away. The monk manages to make a bargain with the kidnapper, gets the young woman back, but she confides that she's been raped and she's already pregnant. And so this monk makes a sign of the cross over her belly, and the same thing happens. Instantly, the pregnancy is over. Instantly. And the monk says, like, well, we can't have like the serpent seed happen. Like, we can't have this evil kidnapper and rapist like have a child. But still, for the woman, like, what a relief, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
again, it's the same thing. Like you just make a sign of the cross, it's done. It's done. And so I think the diversity of experiences and the kind of range of ways that pregnancy was ended, like these are fascinating stories. And again, nothing like what I expected when I went in terms of what we usually think about the Catholic Church and its position on ending a pregnancy.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think that kind of takes us back to the very title of your book, Pushback, right? So, this is this long fight to thwart women by restricting abortion. But of course, then that implies that in lockstep with that fight to restrict these rights, there are those who are fighting to preserve them or to maintain them. And so, given that as you're looking through the historical record and you're just simply not seeing too many records that are direct from the mouths of women, are you finding that there are quite a few kind of allied men along the way that are fighting for abortion rights?
Well, I think the way I think about that is abortion rights is a really modern concept, no offense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
phrase it that way, I think there's always been men who have a vested interest in ending some pregnancies.
Oh, right, especially if they were the one who yeah, were responsible for that pregnancy.
Exactly. So, there's always been male interest and male knowledge. I've recently been actually thinking about that in terms of this case that I've been working on in teeny tiny little place that's outside of Chester in the northwest of England. It's clear that men know stuff as well as women. And I'm like, how did men know? Like, who did they talk to? Because often we think about like abortion knowledge in the past as like women whispering things to other women. And that's probably not wrong. I'm not sure it was as stigmatized as that. I'm not sure they were whispering, but who knows? But then I also see like manuscript recipe books written by men that have abortion recipes in them. So there are circuits of male knowledge also. And I've just begun to think about, well, how do they know? Like, how did they know what to do? How did they know which plant was key? And I don't have answers for that yet, but I do think that men, sometimes just to cover up their misdeeds, other times because they believe that this is what women needed and deserved, would definitely have kinds of knowledge and be sort of significantly invested in some kind of abortion provision. There's a black doctor in who practices in Detroit in the 20th century who, and this is a really tragic story, he refuses an abortion to a young unmarried woman who then kills herself because she can't face it. And that's what changed his mind. And he, like, abortion is deeply illegal. It's against the medical code of ethics. We're talking the 1940s. And he literally goes to Washington, talks to somebody, finds out how to do an abortion effectively, and goes back to Detroit and is a provider for decades, decades. That's thousands of abortions because of this really germinal experience for him where he realized like women needed this and he couldn't face, withholding it from women in need.
Yeah, and I can imagine that there are other examples too where women, as you mentioned, either died by suicide or attempted to perform their own procedures and were like, horrifically injured, if not, died from sort of those self-inflicted wounds.
But the flip side of that, to be congenitally optimistic for a moment, is that like it's what I call the denominator problem. Obviously, we'll never know how many women successfully ended pregnancies and nobody knew because it won't be an historical record. So in the book, I tell stories of women who did successfully end pregnancies without a lot of fuss and bother because I think it's important that we understand that that is also part of the record, that it's not always this morality tale where she dies a horrible death because, which doesn't diminish the tragedies. I would never want to do that. They're terrible. But there is another story running in parallel of women managing their fertility effectively, quietly, for really centuries and centuries and centuries. And we just can see the kind of glimpses of it sometimes in the historical record, but it's important to understand that that's also part of the past.
You're so right, and even thinking about the present, like how many people have successfully used Plan B or mifepristone or like any of these different options that are available without, without any real conversation, without any real it's so common. Well, it was so common and so available. And I think that brings me to sort of my last question, but of course if there's anything else you want to touch on, I think we should. But my last question is one about the way that history ebbs and flows, right? Because I think right now we are in a pretty difficult time, especially here in the United States for all of the American listeners, but across the world, I think everybody sees what's going on here in the US and it's scaring a lot of people. Abortion rights were restricted once again not long ago. I think that we're going to see even more kind of what Project 2025 like pushes towards these quote values that the current administration is pushing. This is not just a regression from what has been a linear progress, right? Like it's often 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Yes, and I just want to say a sidebar because you mentioned mifepristone. One of the things that I sort of marvel at sometimes is that medication abortion, as we now call it, often self managed medication abortion, was the primary way that women ended pregnancies from antiquity forever and ever, like centuries and centuries and centuries. And to sort of come full circle and make that is like now happening again, I just find really interesting and kind of historically like ironic almost, but intriguing. In terms of the big picture, you know, we are living in terrible times. That's absolutely the case. And yet, when I look in the past, what I see is that these terrible times end, that they burn out, that the intensity of them does not get sustained. Over the past 30 years, more than 60 countries and territories have liberalized their abortion laws. Only four nations have gone the other way and rolled it back. That's us, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Poland.
Yeah, we have this bias to only look at, yeah, the regression and the negative kind of impact and forget about the progress that we're making.
Right, and I do think it's real progress. Now, to be clear, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's accessible everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. It's not unproblematic. But I think 60 versus 4, like, that's telling us something. That's telling us something. I just don't think that we're gonna stay this way. When you look at the numbers, like the opinion polls in America today, it seems pretty clear that most people think that this kind of decision should be made between a pregnant person and their healthcare provider. Like that is what most people think. And I do believe that that will triumph in the end, that like we will true out there. I don't know how, I don't know how long it'll take, but when I look back at these flashpoints in the past, they end. And that's why I remain cautiously optimistic that we will get through this and that we will become like those other 60 countries rather than in this kind of fiercely anti woman place that we are now.
I so appreciate that, and I think just to get, like, the slightest bit meta here in the last couple of minutes, I am curious as a historian, how often your process is to situate history against the present, and how often you just kind of get lost in history. Like, do you find yourself thinking about the now and contextualizing the now against how we got to the now as a regular practice, or do you just find yourself kind of lost in the past quite often?
That's such a lovely question. I think I would say that most historians, myself included, we start with questions that have to do with something about today. Like, as I like to say, the last book I published, which was, before the abortion book, was a book about how ordinary people understood reproduction in early modern England. And as I say, it is no accident that I wrote that book while I was trying to get pregnant and then ended up adopting, right? Like that's not a pure coincidence. So I think the questions that we ask are profoundly shaped by the context we find ourselves in. So that drives our questions. It shouldn't drive our answers. We have like a way of proceeding as historians of being true to your sources, not misquoting or making things up. And I really believe that's important. But of course, we shape the stories that we tell. And so, for example, in my book, there's 7 chapters, and there's a woman in each chapter that's kind of the key. And when I was writing, I was like, okay, I cannot have all these women die as a result of like a failed abortion, right? That's not going to be the way it is because I want to underline this other story that we were talking about before that women have successfully ended pregnancies for a very long time. And so I had to kind of balance that. And in that sense, that's the historian's art, right? I do often get lost in the past. I think any historian does, where you're in the details and you're like, wait, why did they say that? What were they alluding to? Or like, where did they find that out? And that's part of the historian's craft also. It's like really get in there and do your absolute best to understand the multiple points of view in any document and like how it was put together and what that tells you about the content. That's like part of what we do. But we live today. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't acknowledge that what we write is in some kind of dialogue with things today.
Well, and it's such an important reason to study history. It's such an important reason to read history is to inform how we got to where we are and how we should proceed. And if we don't engage with history in that way, which I think many of us do not, I think we're doing ourselves a real disservice.
Well, and I sometimes half jokingly say it's a great time to be a historian. History's on the front pages every day, not always in ways we might like, but history is being mobilized constantly towards various kinds of decisions and positions. So let's do good history, right? Let's do responsible history and try to understand some of the complexities that could inform where we are today.
Absolutely. So I'm curious if there's anything else that you feel like is a takeaway or something that you would be remiss if like the listeners didn't know about the book before they head out and pick up a copy of their own.
No, I think we've really covered a lot of the ground. Thank you for that, though. I mean, I would just say again, women have ended pregnancies for as long as we can see in the past. That's just like, I feel like we can say that, we need to say that all the time to understand that, to give a much longer timeline than I think most people know. But we did talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important that that did kind of bear repeating, that we unequivocally can say that. We have good evidence to support that. And yeah, this is not a new issue, not by a long shot. And there's a lot that we can learn about the past, starting with your book, Pushback, the 2,500-year fight to thwart women by restricting abortion by Dr. Mary Fissell. Mary, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kara. I've really enjoyed our discussion.
And everybody, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.